Hi, I'm Abby from RTINGS.com, and here we are again at the high end of the TV market with the two top dogs, the LG G4 and the Sony BRAVIA 9. Being that we're here at the top of the TV food chain, if you choose to buy either of these TVs, you'll be happy either way, as they're both fantastic. Now, we've already done a video comparing the G4's baby sibling, the LG C4, to the Sony BRAVIA 9, and it turns out that the mid-range C4 is surprisingly competitive with the super high-end BRAVIA 9. But what about the G4? Can the added boost of brightness from the MLA layer bring the competition even closer? Grab your popcorn, we're about to go for a ride. We bought and tested the 65-inch LG G4 and Sony BRAVIA 9, and both TVs are available in a variety of other sizes, all of which perform similarly to the 65-inch models. There's only one exception, the 97-inch G4, which is the G4's biggest model size and doesn't have the MLA focusing layer. This means it isn't as bright as the G4's other sizes. Oh, and the two smallest G4 sizes, the 55 and 65-inch models, come with a stand, while the three biggest sizes, namely the 77, 83, and 97-inch models, come with LG's slim wall mount instead. Whew, okay. Now, as with most of our comparison videos, we'll emphasize the differences between these two TVs instead of rehashing their similarities. In this one, we'll cover build quality, contrast, HDR and SDR brightness, color gamut and color volume, viewing angle and reflections, and the TV's gaming performance. When looking at these TVs, two things stick out: their bottom bezel and their respective stands. The bezel isn't that interesting, the G4's is much thinner, so it looks a little more evenly framed than the Sony. But the stands are different. The G4 has a sturdy center-mounted stand screwed into the back of the TV. It's height adjustable to two different positions, a low position, which lifts the TV about 2.3 inches from the table, and a high position, which pushes the TV up to 3.9 inches. You almost get the sense that the G4 wasn't really designed with a stand in mind, as it does wobble a bit more than the other LG OLEDs. Still, it won't cause any issues. Inversely, the Sony opts for 2 feet. They can be adjusted to 4 different positions, 2 horizontal and 2 vertical positions. On the 65-inch model, the narrow horizontal position leaves about 18.8 inches of space between the feet, while the wider position has 55.8 inches of space. On the vertical axis, you can lift your TV up about 1.3 inches from the table, which is extremely close to it, or up about 3.7 inches. Like many TVs using feet, they're incredibly sturdy, and the BRAVIA 9 wobbles noticeably less than the G4 does. Ultimately, both stands offer a plethora of options when it comes to placement. Of course, you can also mount both TVs using their VESA mounting points, but only the bigger sizes of the G4 come with LG's slim wall mount in the box. For cable management, the BRAVIA 9 has plastic covers behind which you can hide your cables, and you can funnel the cables through the TV's feet. On the LG G4, you can funnel cables through the stand, or if you're using the wall mount, you can funnel cables through clips on the back instead. The ports on both TVs are on the left when viewed from the front. They're a bit easier to access on the Sony since they're closer to the edge, while they're pushed more towards the middle on the LG. Plus, 2 of the G4's HDMI ports and 1 of its USB ports face the left side, with the rest of the ports facing the bottom, making them hard to access from the side. If you use LG's slim wall mount, which can be bought separately for the 55 and 65-inch models, you're in luck, as it's designed to be easily pulled away from the wall, giving you easier access to the TV's ports. As for the inputs themselves, the LG has 4 HDMI 2.1 ports, while the Sony also has 4 HDMI ports, but only 2 are 2.1 ports. Also, one of the Sony's HDMI 2.1 ports is also the eARC port, so you'll lose it if you have a soundbar connected to your TV through HDMI. The G4 is capable of up to 4K at 144 Hz on all of its HDMI 2.1 ports, while the Sony is limited to 4K at 120 Hz. They both pass through all major audio formats from Dolby and DTS and support the popular Dolby Vision HDR format. The G4 has 3 USB 2.0 ports, a LAN port, an optical digital audio out ports, and an antenna connection. The BRAVIA 9 has the same ports, but with 1 USB 2.0 and 1 3.0 port. The BRAVIA's digital audio out port also doubles as its S-center input, letting you use the TV's speakers as a center channel when paired with compatible Sony soundbars or receivers. Both TVs have Wi-Fi 6E, so they support the 6 GHz Wi-Fi band, which is great for those of you with newer routers. The Sony has an ATSC 3.0 tuner, so you can watch 4K content over the air, while the LG has 1.0, which is limited to 1080p. Want to be blown away by how glorious your new TV looks in action? You're in luck, as both TVs look amazing. Still, there are some differences due to their underlying panel technologies, high-end OLED versus high-end LED. So let's start with contrast. The BRAVIA 9 has exceptional contrast, there's no denying it, but it's still an LED TV. LED TVs have backlights that are always on, which means that they can't achieve true blacks. They now get close though, as local dimming technology lets them dim individual zones on the screen to the point where, to the naked eye, they basically look like true black, even though they are not. OLEDs don't use backlights, as each individual pixel emits its own light. This not only lets OLEDs control light output at a pixel level, but they can also shut off the pixels entirely to achieve true blacks. Thus, even though the BRAVIA 9 has truly fantastic contrast for an LED TV, the LG G4 has the clear edge here with its nearly infinite contrast ratio. And this is true of any OLED, not just ultra high-end models. There's also no blooming and no zone transitions on OLEDs, since no backlight equals no dimming zones. We want to make it clear, though, that the Sony BRAVIA 9 has outstanding contrast. It's just competing against a technology that has basically perfected contrast. At least the BRAVIA 9 can fall back on what LED TVs do best: brightness. Right? Well, yes, kind of. However, here it's not just competing against any old OLED. It's competing against the brightest OLED of 2024, one equipped with MLA. Does it matter? Yeah, actually it does, as the G4 is noticeably brighter than the C4, the MLA-less mid-tier offering. Still, there's no doubt that the BRAVIA 9 has more brightness in the tank, as it can surpass the G4 on test slides. In real content, it's not quite as clear-cut, as the G4 often matches and sometimes even surpasses the BRAVIA 9. It's likely that the OLED's self-emissive pixels let it truly emphasize bright highlights in a way that the BRAVIA 9 struggles with when dealing with complex scenes. You can make the BRAVIA 9 significantly brighter overall by enabling the Advanced Contrast Enhancer setting, but it comes at the cost of image accuracy. Ultimately, the Sony can indeed get brighter, but in most content you might have a hard time telling the difference. Both TVs have a very wide color gamut, although the G4 covers almost the entirety of the DCI-P3 color space used in most HDR content, with the Sony trailing just a tad behind here. Inversely, the Sony covers a bit more of the wider, but less used Rec 2020 color space. But really, they're nearly identical here, in either color space. Where they're not identical is in color volume. This is where the Sony's brightness advantage comes into play. It's more capable of displaying brighter colors than the G4. Plus, the BRAVIA 9's terrific contrast lets it display dark saturated colors well too, making it look a bit more vibrant in action than the G4. Still, the G4 is no slouch here, and it looks very colorful in isolation. It just falters a bit when put in direct comparison with the Sony side by side. SDR Brightness is where LED TVs really flex their muscles, and the same is true here. The BRAVIA 9 is twice as bright as the LG G4 in real content, with the G4 hitting just over 500 nits and the Sony reaching about 1000 nits. 500 nits is bright enough for any room, but in very bright rooms, you might wish that your G4 could get a tiny bit brighter. Ultimately, the BRAVIA 9 looks better in bright rooms and is the better option of the two if you want to buy a TV for a bright skyscraper loft. The G4 does have a slight equalizer here, as its reflection handling is a tad better than the BRAVIA 9's, but not by much. Still, it'll compensate for some, but certainly not all of the Sony's brightness advantage in SDR content. If you're particularly sensitive to rainbow smearing, keep in mind that the Sony does have some of it when it's dealing with glare from direct reflections. It's minor, but it's there. Sorry LED TVs, but this is never a good comparison for you. The viewing angle on an OLED is always, at least, excellent. While on LEDs, well, let's just say that LED TVs are not known for letting you sit at extreme angles with no loss of image quality whatsoever. The BRAVIA 9 is far from having the worst viewing angle we've seen, but it's mediocre, and it really struggles next to the G4s. Want to host large parties with people sitting all around the TV? Get the G4. Do you like to watch content with large areas of bright, uniform color, like hockey or tennis? Well, you'll be satisfied with the Bravia 9, but you're likely going to notice a darker patch of color here and there when the camera pans around, as it does have noticeable dirty screen effect near the middle of the panel. The edges are darker than the center. Not so much on the G4. Although there are some faint vertical lines, they're not typically noticeable from a normal viewing distance. But those of you who sit close to a large G4 could, in some content, notice these lines. But if you swap the G4 for the Bravia 9 in that same context, you'll notice uniformity issues. So ultimately, the G4 has the edge here. Just note that these uniformity issues are panel dependent. But on average, the G4 will have better uniformity than the Bravia 9. Normally, we wouldn't talk about image processing as these two TVs are extremely close, and we're focusing on obvious differences. However, the Sony brand does have the reputation of having the best image processing in the business, so we can't really gloss over that. What we can say is that LG is right on Sony's tail these days. The G4 is almost as good as the Bravia 9. Heck, the G4 is even better when dealing with low bitrate content from streaming apps, as it smooths out more compression artifacts than the Bravia 9, but just barely. Where the Sony has a more obvious edge is in its sharpness processing when dealing with low-resolution content. The G4 does a great job here, with low-resolution content looking clear and clean, but some fine details are still hard to make out. Not so much with the Bravia 9, as it manages to make low-resolution content look as good as it can. Just remember that no matter how good the upscaling is, low-resolution content still looks low-resolution. But the Bravia 9 cleans it up better than the G4 does. You're a gamer? Get the G4. Okay, that's a bit harsh, but it's also not false. You'll have to weigh the pros and cons of each panel technology, but there's no doubt that OLEDs are the best gaming panels available for one main reason: their response time. Well, it's not exactly instantaneous, it's close. Once you've experienced gaming on an OLED, it can be hard to go back to an LED panel, as they feel blurrier overall, especially when dealing with transitions from dark colors to lighter colors, which leads to what we call black smearing. That's when you see a noticeable trail behind fast-moving objects in dark scenes. And this is due to the slow black to gray pixel transition speed of many LED TVs. OLEDs are also slower here too than with other transitions, but in this case we're talking about milliseconds, which is hard to notice with the human eye. The Bravia 9 is a very fast LED TV, and any gamer would be quite happy with it. But it's just not an OLED. And if gaming is one of your primary use cases, it's hard to recommend it over the G4 here. When it comes to input lag, the G4 has another clear edge over the Bravia 9. This doesn't matter for most people, however, as the Bravia's input lag is still low enough for basically any gamer out there. But if you're a competitive gamer and you're looking for the edge, yes, you might be able to tell the difference between the 5.4 milliseconds of the G4 versus the 9.8 milliseconds of the Bravia 9 when running at 4K at 120 Hz. And for PC gamers, the LG G4 is capable of gaming at 4K at 144 Hz with an even lower input lag of 4.6 milliseconds. We'll say the same thing here as in our comparison with the C4. If you care about input lag, look at the G4. If you're not sure if you should care, they're both fantastic. Before moving on to the verdict, a quick note about stutter. The faster the response time, the more stutter the TV will have in slow panning shots when watching movies. This results in a jarring effect where you can perceive each frame independently instead of having them blend into one another. On an OLED, the stutter is noticeable enough that many people will feel the need to enable some of the TV's motion smoothing features. The Bravia 9 also has a very fast response time, and it does stutter, but it's noticeably better than the G4. So, you know what's coming. Which of these TVs should you buy? Well, the G4 is overall the better product for most people. It isn't really a surprise, as the C4 was very competitive and in many ways outperformed the much more high-end Bravia 9. The Sony is still brighter than the LG in HDR content, or at least it's capable of being brighter, as in most HDR content, the G4 is surprisingly close, and sometimes even slightly outperforms the Bravia 9 in very complex scenes. The Sony is still far superior in SDR content, but the G4's brightness boost over the C4 means that while the cheaper LG OLED could feel a bit too dim in SDR in most lighting conditions, the G4 is going to look quite bright in any context, except perhaps extremely bright rooms. If you are in such a bright room, get the Bravia 9, as it is scintillating at its max brightness in SDR. Aside from that scenario, it's hard to argue against the LG G4, especially as it's typically sold for a cheaper price than the BRAVIA 9. It has better contrast, no blooming or lighting zone transitions, and much better motion performance. It's also the superior product for gamers due to having 4 HDMI 2.1 ports all capable of 4K at 144 Hz, with faster input lag and response time. For movies, the BRAVIA 9 has better image processing, but the G4 is still quite close. Still, if image processing is your primary concern, the Sony has a slight edge overall here. You'll have to decide for yourself whether it's worth the price difference. As for alternatives, well, the BRAVIA 9 is the best LED TV we've ever reviewed, and it's also the most expensive, so there are really no alternatives to it. You could step down to the cheaper BRAVIA 7, which the BRAVIA 9 certainly outperforms, especially when watching content mastered at 4000 nits, and it does have better contrast. But otherwise, the BRAVIA 7 is surprisingly close to its more expensive sibling with the exact same feature set. The one thing that is really holding the BRAVIA 7 back is its satisfactory reflection handling. It's significantly worse than the BRAVIA 9's, and it hurts the 7's performance in brighter rooms. The BRAVIA 7 is often sold for half of the 9's price, so it's still worth considering. The G4 does have a few alternatives, one of them being Sony's 2023 flagship, the A95L. Here, the G4 has the edge for gaming, as it has FreeSync and 4 HDMI 2.1 ports with up to 4K at 144 Hz support, and it doesn't lose any of its brightness in game mode. Plus, it still has better input lag. Still, the A95L does have a wider color gamut and slightly better image processing, so if watching movies is your primary interest, then the A95L does perform a bit better. It's close, and again, the Sony is more expensive than the LG. That's all for our comparison of the LG G4 and the Sony BRAVIA 9. If you want a more detailed write-up on the TVs, check out our written reviews. The links are in the description below. Until next time, I'm Abby from RTINGS.com, where we help you find the best product for your needs. For those of you who stay to the end of this video, I speak to you. This is the 50th time I've appeared on camera this year. Congratulations. You have been graced with my presence. But also, thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button.